Live, local, trusted. This is WKYT News.
Good afternoon once again at 4:30. The news continues on your Friday. We're glad you're with us. Earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a federal law that bans people who are subject to domestic violence restraining orders from having firearms. WKYT's Jessica Umbro spoke with groups that work with victims of domestic violence and got their reaction to the 8-1 decision. That's our top story at 4:30.
The Supreme Court's nearly unanimous decision to temporarily restrict gun access for those with domestic violence orders against them comes as happy news to those who work with domestic violence survivors on a daily basis.
The news hit us really quickly in Kentucky, and we are all super excited about the protections that it'll afford survivors of domestic violence.
Diane Fleet of Greenhouse 17, a domestic violence agency that helps those facing intimate partner violence, says the decision preserves the strength of protective orders as a means to keep victims safe.
We have always felt really comfortable with protective orders being one of the ways for people that have been in court and have been identified as people who have caused harm and caused abuse and coercion to their families to be flagged.
In 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that gun restrictions have to be analyzed in consideration of the historical understanding of the right to bear arms, a stance that brought into question existing gun restrictions. But now those who work with survivors say they have clarity on the topic and can move forward.
We can refocus on implementing solutions to prevent intimate partner violence and gun violence while preserving the lawful use of firearms for sport and personal protection.
I'm told that it's not just the decision today that comes as a pleasant surprise, but it's also the fact that only one justice, Justice Clarence Thomas, was in disagreement. In Lexington, Jessica Umbro, WKYT.
And Justice Clarence Thomas wrote as a part of his dissenting opinion about the ruling that the decision, quote, strips an individual of his ability to possess firearms and ammunition without any due process. He notes the restriction on ownership does not require a criminal conviction.